Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to start in just a minute or two. Given the open seats here and the kind of, bowling alley configuration, if I could gently implore those of you hanging out in the kitchen in the back to come forward and to have a seat, that would be great. We'll start in just 60 seconds. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the second day of the Tanner Lectures on AI and Human Values. My name is Rob Reish. I am a faculty member in the Political Science Department and a member of the Center for Ethics and Society, as well as the Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence, which together are the sponsors of the Tanner Lectures on AI and Human Values. Our speaker tonight, Seth Lazar, whom if you were here yesterday, you saw and heard an introduction about. The speaker tonight, as well as our second discussant, will be introduced by Diana Acosta Navas, and I would like to just say a brief word about her. Diana is a postdoctoral fellow currently at the Center for Ethics and Society and the Institute for Human-Centered AI, and she does work on a program here on campus that also exists in other campuses called Embedded Ethics. Ethics is spelled cutesily, lowercase ETHI, capital C, capital S for computer science. And the Embedded Ethics Initiative is to combine postdoctoral fellows like Diana with training in philosophy, with computer science faculty and master's students to develop ethics modules that get inserted into all of the core courses of the computer science major, to make ethics, as it were, an inescapable field of study throughout the entire course of a computer science student's education. Diana got her PhD in philosophy from Harvard University. She's just completing her second year of a fellowship here. She was an undergraduate in philosophy in Bogota, Colombia. Her scholarship, in addition to writing about issues that are central to the topic of tonight's lecture by Seth on the digital public sphere, has focused in the past on the moral and political significance of transitional justice and the institutions designed to carry out transitional justice. Think, for example, post-genocide Rwanda as a way of thinking about how that works. All right, with that, please welcome Diana Acosta Navas.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the second of this year's Stanford Lectures on AI and Human Values at Stanford University. This is co-hosted by the McCoy Family Center for Ethics and Society and the Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence. I want to thank the teams who made this event possible, all of you who are here and all of you who are joining us virtually. It is my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce our two speakers this evening. Professor Seth Lazar delivered the first lecture yesterday and will deliver a second lecture this evening. He is a professor of philosophy at the Australian National University, an Australian Research Council Future Fellow, and a distinguished research fellow of the University of Oxford Institute for Ethics in AI. He is one of the authors of a study by the US National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, which reported to Congress on the ethics and governance of responsible computing research. He also leads the Machine Intelligence and Normative Theory Lab, where he directs research projects on the moral and political philosophy of AI. Some of his central academic pursuits are oriented towards analyzing how we may reshape society in order to either legitimize or eliminate the new power relations enabled by intelligent systems. He seeks to understand how we may design those systems so that they take our moral and political values into account, and so that they're calibrated to work with humans as we are, given our fallibility, our biases, and the fact that our behavior changes in response to our interactions with these systems. But Professor Lazar does not only think about these issues, he enacts them. Besides his academic pursuits, he has engaged in the aesthetic pursuit of photography. His website showcases photographs of landscapes, buildings, people, streets, and night skies. His work as a photographer can be seen as a way of addressing the preoccupations that drive his academic research. With current technologies that place powerful cameras in so many people's pockets, with sophisticated digital filters that make human skill and effort seem redundant, and with the overproliferation of images generated by artificial intelligence, it'd be easy to give up on photography as a worthy pursuit and downplay the value of its products. So pursuing photography as a creative endeavor is an act of resistance to the thoughtless embracing of the way that technology inadvertently impacts our values. It constitutes a deliberate attempt to protect and rescue aesthetic values and to imbue those values into our relationship with technology through thoughtful human effort and agency. This year's standard lectures follow on this trend, reflecting on the complex relation between artificial intelligence and human values. Yesterday's lecture discussed the new power relations that emerge through the action of algorithmic intermediaries. Today's lecture will focus on algorithmic power in the public forum and how we may encode the value of communicative justice through algorithmic intermediaries that shape communication and distribute attention in the digital public forum. Our discussant this evening has worked extensively on these topics. Professor Arvind Narayanan is a professor of computer science at Princeton, where he leads the Web Transparency and Accountability Project. He is a recipient of the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers, twice a recipient of the Privacy Enhancing Technologies Award, and thrice the recipient of the Privacy Papers for Policymakers Award. Professor Narayanan co-created an open online course and textbook on Bitcoin and cryptocurrency, which has been used in over 150 courses worldwide. His recent work has shown how machine learning reflects cultural stereotypes, and his doctoral research showed the limits of de-identification. Professor Narayanan is also currently leading a research project that examines how algorithms shape the speech environment on social media platforms, aiming to sharpen our understanding of the ways in which platforms can distort speech. Interestingly, he is also an active user of social networks, leveraging their digital infrastructure to promote those things he cares about. Every day through Twitter, he is educating his over 100,000 followers and advising many computer science students. In fact, he is so good at tweeting that one of his tweets on detecting AI snake oil is now turning into a book. So the format for tonight's event will consist of a lecture by Professor Lazar, followed by a commentary by Professor Narayanan. After his remarks, he will join Professor Lazar in a conversation moderated by Professor Rob Reich, and together they will take a few questions from the audience. Tomorrow there will be a discussion seminar at 10 a.m. with discussants Joshua Cohen and Renee Jorgensen. And so for now, please join me in welcoming our speakers.
Thank you, Diana, for that lovely introduction. So did anything happen in the news today that was relevant to this talk? I don't know, maybe something. I knew a little while ago that this would be around the time when the Trump sort of reinstatement to Meta was going to be, Meta's platforms was going to be discussed. I didn't know it would be exactly on the day, but it's extremely on point for what I'm going to be talking about tonight. Let me just begin though by giving a quick sort of précis for those who weren't here last night of the first lecture. It's not going to matter a ton. The lecture that I'm giving tonight really does stand on its own. But at the same time, I'm trying to sort of show how this sort of methodology that I described last night is going to be applied and is sort of carried through in this particular case. So the basic idea of yesterday's talk was that where I was identifying this way in which new algorithmic intermediaries are reshaping social relations. Algorithmic intermediaries are socio-technical systems. They use algorithmic tools such as machine learning to enable people to communicate with and act on other people in ways that the intermediary can dynamically shape. So not content-independent pipes, but actually sort of actively shaping the nature of the ways in which people are able to communicate and act on each other. Digital platforms are the paradigm case, but they're not exhaustive of the form. Yesterday, I proposed a model of how these algorithmic intermediaries shape the social relations that they constitute, and when they do so, how they exercise governing power. And I argued that political philosophy faces new questions about how that power can be justified. So the goal tonight is basically to take that general picture and to apply it to the case of the digital public sphere, which is just our digital environment for public communication. And yeah, this is an extraordinary day to be discussing this on. And actually, funnily enough, the first time I gave this talk as a sort of practice was on the day that Elon Musk acquired Twitter. So I don't know if this is sort of serendipitous or it just shows that on any given day, something mental is probably happening in the context of the digital public sphere. I'm glad that the two Supreme Court cases, the Paris bombing one and the Texas one, have been pushed out to next year. Because that would have completely absorbed all of our attention. Okay, so let's just start with something we can probably all agree on. And I'm not going to go into and try and defend in great depth, but the digital public sphere is not in particularly good health. I want to be clear, it's not all bad, and it's easy to get into a kind of moral panic about this. There are kind of really important and valuable corners of the digital public sphere, not least, as Diana just mentioned, it's where Arvind produces such awesome kind of and helpful guides to various things in machine learning, which is where I first discovered his work, and then invited him to be a keynote at the AIES. Right, so there are good things happening out there, especially for minority communities that find one another and find themselves together. But at the same time, it's almost a commonplace now to lament all of the pathologies, whether they be epistemic crisis caused by misinformation and inauthentic coordinated behavior, which is obviously only going to get worse with the ability to make bots that are able to communicate precisely like humans. The silencing, harassment, and abuse that we've seen kind of radically accelerate on Twitter since Musk took over. Manipulation, radicalisation, affective polarisation. Interesting point on affective polarisation. People often sort of ask whether is social media actually causing polarisation. They often interpret that as being ideological polarisation, kind of a la Cass-Sunstein. And they find kind of mixed results on that empirically. But on affective polarization, the case is really clear. So especially in the US, two sides of politics have formed these two sort of big identity groups. And the degree to which they dislike each other has been accelerating. And as someone said yesterday, these systems have arguably even fomented civil war and genocide in places like Sri Lanka and in the Rohingya region of Burma. So the picture is not good. That is going to be a given. I'm not going to defend that claim. In the paper, I talk about some of the empirical stuff here. And I think there are some interesting empirical questions about what are the best ways to study this. But for the most part, I'm going to take it as a given. What I'm going to argue for is, first of all, that algorithmic intermediaries govern the digital public sphere. So that will essentially be an application of the ideas from last night. In this context, I'm mainly focusing on social media. There's an important role for operating systems, app stores, even the security and sort of cloud companies that provide the underlying infrastructure for the internet. They too play a significant role in governing the digital public sphere. But mostly I'm focusing on social media companies. So the first claim is that they govern the digital public sphere, and therefore they have a responsibility to do so better. But then, the next thought is well, what's the goal they should be aiming for? What's the regulating ideal for governance of the digital public sphere? And there I argue that when you go to political philosophy for a source for an answer, you tend to find that you find sort of tools that aren't well adapted to the task. In particular, I think that political philosophy has largely assumed that the task when thinking about the digital public sphere is just to protect the sort of boundaries of permissible speech, put in place these barriers around beyond which the state can't go, within which unmediated interaction is possible. If you remember from last night, this is the extrinsic power that I talked about. And then a healthy public sphere will kind of emerge spontaneously from those background conditions. Right? That's kind of the central idea that you find through a lot of political philosophy. And it's not enough. It doesn't tell us in particular how we can do these new things that algorithmic intermediaries enable us to do, this intermediary governance in the terms I introduced yesterday, in particular, the ways in which they shape communication and distribute attention. So I'm going to argue that we need a theory of communicative justice to provide a regulating ideal for shaping public communication and distributing attention. And actually, it will turn out that those principles will have application even to cases like what happened today with Meta reinstating Donald Trump. Okay, and I will say at the outset, before I dive in, this is very much a political philosophy paper. This is not a paper about the US Constitution. It's not a paper about the First Amendment. It's not a paper in law. Obviously, in some ways, that's a kind of applied political philosophy. But I'm really focusing very much on the underlying principles. And I'd love to talk with people about the legal application of them, but it's definitely not my area of expertise. Okay. Everyone should know, by the way, if you do want to have the handout, it is linked up there. Or you can go to write.as/Settlazar. Yeah, for those of you who didn't come yesterday, I don't like slides. I didn't get to make my point yesterday, by the way, about AI art. Has everybody here, I assume, has seen a bunch of presentations lately with lots and lots of images from DALL-E and Midjourney and Stable Diffusion and everything. And no shade on the people who are doing it. Like, I get it, it's fun. But it's starting to look a bit naff. You know what I mean? Like, it's getting a bit clip arty. It's a bit literal. So that's kind of why I wanted to go kind of old school. And actually, the handout itself is hosted on write.as, which is a blogging platform which is on the Fediverse. It connects up with ActivityPub, and so you can follow things from there on Mastodon, what have you. So it sort of illustrates one of the things I'll be talking about, which is sort of the decentralized approach to governing the digital public sphere. That will come up a bit later. Okay, so starting point, I think that algorithmic intermediaries govern the digital public sphere. In particular, they shape communication and they distribute attention. And I want to draw attention to three key dimensions of this. And it's really important to pay attention to all three: architecture, amplification, and moderation. And they all work together and they all sort of blur into one another. Really important. So architecture is platform design, the ways in which the design of the platform shapes how it's possible to communicate. This has been super interesting since the sort of, the Musk apocalypse at Twitter and the #Twitter migration. Everyone goes into Mastodon. There's been so much conversation and discourse on Mastodon lately about platform design, like long discussions about quote tweeting. The ways in which, I talked about this yesterday, the ways in which the technologies that we use shape the options that are available to us is incredibly apparent with these platforms for digital communication, which enable you to communicate in certain ways and make certain ways easy, and they frustrate other kinds of communication. This comes up in lots of different ways, and there's a really, the work in communication studies on this is brilliant. There's lots of things that I've drawn on. I particularly like Steve Nathan's work on Facebook and Jamie Settle's work as well, but loads of other people I cite in the paper. Just three little examples. Quantification as a sort of a general kind of trope of social media, the way in which it leads one to sort of aim to optimize a certain metrics. You look back and you see your tweet or whatever it might be, and you see how much engagement it got, and that leads to incentivizing certain kinds of behavior and disincentivizing others. Not for nothing, but the AI ethics Twitter has been dead since all of our comrades at Twitter's Meta were fired when Musk took over. But it came back with the awful revelations about Nick Bostrom's racist emails and his racist apology. It was really striking that all of these people who had presumably been scrolling Twitter but not saying anything, we all came back on because there was this awful thing that happened, and it generated a bunch of engagement. Right, so the structures of the platforms incentivize a certain kind of response to a certain kind of emotive content. Context collapse, another really interesting one that's been studied loads over the last 15 years. I really like Jamie Settle's work on this, where she shows that the ways in which Facebook enables us to see, sort of blend together your political opinions, your sort of personal news, your sort of random thoughts on the day, means that we've all become really good at inferring the political identities or political preferences of especially our weak ties on social media, in such a way that we kind of sort people. Obviously, this has been the study was done in the US, but where folks sort people into one group or the other, and then a bunch of in-group, out-group phenomena take over, which is just sort of well understood from psychology. So the kind of the context collapse that blends all of these things together into one ends up making it really easy to be like, oh, that guy's just a super Trumpy, or he's extreme MAGA or whatever, and they can criticize the liberals on the other side. Things like character limits, like really simple constraints like that. These are all are affordances of these platforms, and it's really important to recognize that that doesn't mean that if you change the character limit on Twitter that suddenly everything's going to be fine. Whatever, this stuff is all really complex. It makes certain things kind of more likely, other things less likely. But nonetheless, the ways in which these platforms are designed has shaped public communication. You weren't able to have it. Me and Arvind, 30 years ago, wouldn't have been able to have a meaningful public conversation online in any real way that folks would have noticed. And we are now able to do it, and this has all been designed by platforms over the last, in particular, over the last 10 years, the ways in which we do it now. So they're shaping public communication through platform design and architecture. Then there's algorithmic amplification. Okay, one thing that I really want to stress at the outset is that, again, like I said yesterday, it's really easy to reify the algorithm part of this, to say that recommender systems are to blame for everything, and that's what's causing all of the trouble in the world today. We see that a lot actually in the Twitter Mastodon debate, and I'm going to talk about sort of alternatives later. But pulling the algorithms out on their own and looking at them in isolation is a mistake. They're always working in conjunction with platform architecture. At the very least, recommender systems rely on the architecture of the platform to provide cues or signal that is then used to determine how sort of items are going to be ranked in your feed, like what content you're going to see. So they're filtering first, deciding what things are possible options for you to see. Then they're ranking them, and they're doing so on the basis of likes, retweets, whatever it might be, so things that are provided for them by the platform architecture. You can't really separate them out one from the other. But at the same time, they do, they optimize, they identify what are the things that are most likely to generate engagement, and then they incentivize them, right? And as has been very widely remarked, it's considerably more likely that emotive content expressing outrage, communications that express outrage, are going to be promoted by these recommender systems than not. And that's because they lead people to spend time on platform, which is ultimately what the recommender systems are optimizing for, right? If what you're optimizing for is engagement at all costs, then it's going to turn out that stuff that is outrageous or upsetting, or that gets people kind of riled up, is going to engage them more. So again, recommender systems are shaping the distribution of attention, not only in this positive sort of amplifying way, but also, and now this is being much more discussed, in the way of kind of demoting and reducing the distribution or the visibility of communications online. It's really interesting just to sort of do a little snapshot of this and think that, like a year or two ago, like the concept of shadow banning was really not in the kind of public discourse. There were some interesting papers in communication studies, but it wasn't much in the public discourse. Over the last few months, it's become very prominent. It's now a central part of the document that Meta put out today, describing their policy of letting Trump back onto the platform, where they've basically said that they're going to be using various forms of kind of algorithmic and other forms of reduction of visibility in the event that harmful content continues to be produced. So that's another sort of side of it. There's amplification, there's also reduction. One thing that's just an interesting conceptual point that Daphne Keller has made, a Stanford law prof, is that there isn't really some sort of baseline between these two, some point of like, this is the amount of distribution a given communication would have in the absence of any intervention. There's always intervention of some kind or other. So it's something somewhat artificial about having this line between amplification and reduction. Still, though, these are important ways in which recommender systems are used to shape what you see online and to distribute attention. And then the last leg of the tripod is moderation. And again, we all now are deeply versed in debates about content moderation. They're in front of the Supreme Court. They're kind of on the front pages of the news. Musk is tweeting about them every 5 minutes to 120 million people. It's really interesting to note that when Nick Souza wrote his book Lawless, he subtitled it "The Secret Rules That Govern the Internet." It was about content moderation. It was secret. People weren't talking about it at all. When Talden Gillespie's book, Custodian of the Internet, similar sort of vibe. Sarah Roberts' book, Behind the Screen, behind the screen, both in the sense that there are people who are doing the content moderation that you never see, but also in the sense that we weren't paying attention to it at all. It's really interesting how it's become part of the public discourse. And there are people here at Stanford who are doing some of the most interesting work on it from the legal side. The basic idea, obviously, of content moderation is just the removal or suspension of accounts or the removal of content. And yeah, very much in the public eye. And if you look at Facebook's kind of set of norms that it publicized today with Trump's reinstatement, they're all fundamentally about what is the content we're going to remove or reduce. Okay, it's all really a way of stating in as public a form as possible its apparent content moderation policies. The oversight board is fundamentally there for that purpose too. It's about the removal of content. I'm going to talk mostly in this lecture not so much about that part of the way in which platforms govern the digital public sphere, but more about the architecture and amplification part, more about the shaping public communication and distributing attention part. And the main reason for that is that I think it's the bit that is most sort of, like I said yesterday, most interestingly new, and for which we most need new work in political philosophy. Now, I want to be clear and just address some sort of possible confusions or clarifications at the outset. So I think that the way in which platforms shape communication, distribute attention, is an example of them governing the digital public sphere, setting norms, implementing them, enforcing them, making things possible for us online, making it possible for us to communicate in certain ways online. I don't mean that only platforms govern, right? States also govern the digital public sphere. There's no doubt about that. I think it's kind of interesting that very often states have to operate through the platform. With the new EU Act, the Digital Services Act, it sets out criteria that the platforms have to meet. The platforms then have to implement them. There's an analogy to the ways in which copyright has been enforced. And there are probably lessons that we can learn from that. But the main point is that the state is only able to kind of say, this is how the platform should be governed. When it comes to actually doing it, that tends to fall to the platforms themselves. So I think it's really important that we really do focus on algorithmic governance here by the platforms. I want to address also there's an objection that might be raised here that the pathologies that I described are not really the fault of the platforms. I've talked about architecture, amplification, moderation, and I gave you a list of pathologies: epistemic crisis, affective polarisation, and some people would argue that those crises stem from other causes. They're explained by other things. There are factors in the United States, for example, that antedate the rise of the digital platforms and that are the true explanation for the pathologies of democracy. Now, I think this is an interesting point, and this is one of the things I want to kind of contribute to the debate. I don't think this matters whether it's true or not so much. It's always true that social pathologies kind of come from, well, at least partially from us, the people in the society. Right, that's kind of the nature of them. You get a bunch of people together, and some of us do bad things to other people. That doesn't absolve those who govern in that space from responsibility for fixing it. Right, their responsibility for fixing these problems doesn't depend on a causal story about how they've caused them. They're the only cause for these things happening. That's not actually necessary for the moral argument to go through. There's three other ways in which you can explain why algorithmic intermediaries that govern the digital public sphere have a responsibility to govern it better. So one way is just that even if they're not the only cause, they're certainly implicated, right? And that's a clear problem. Frankly, they've profited from it, which is another ground for having a responsibility. Second is the fact that they have the capacity to actually do something about it. You can just have a remedial responsibility grounded in the fact that you're the only one who's able to do something. And likely they are the only ones in a position to do anything at scale. And then lastly, even independent of these points, if you govern in a particular domain, then the norms that you defend, the norms that you advocate for, they don't only matter insofar as they achieve certain objectives. That obviously is the primary way in which they matter, no doubt. But it also matters that they express your values. They give some sense of they give a sense of what you value, what you care for, what you hold up in esteem and endorse. And that's something that we recognize in the law, and this is connected to the argument or the account of the expressive function of the law, right? Even if they're not able to achieve a certain objective, the fact that they articulate a value that you care about is important. And I think there's something that we can say here about the expressive function of code too. It's important that we express the values that we have, we express that we're not satisfied with things being this way, even if it proves to be really hard to fix these problems. And maybe out of our crooked timber, nothing straight will be made. But still, it's really important to try. Okay, so this just starts out the normative case for platforms being responsible for governing the digital public sphere and having an obligation to do something about it and to govern it better. So that then leaves us asking, okay, well, what would that mean? What would it mean to rule well in this space? And there are different approaches. One approach, which I know lots of people are taking, is a kind of pathology-specific approach. What you do is you go around and you whack-a-mole each of the problems, and you try and find a particular solution for it. And that's obviously really important and urgent, especially right now. But I think there's another way to respond to this kind of problem, which is to articulate a positive ideal to aim at. Now, I talked about this yesterday as one of the functions of philosophy, how it can contribute here. Not only helping us kind of diagnose and parse moral wrongs, but also providing us a kind of an ideal that we can shoot for. And I think that this is going to help in a number of ways. Sometimes it will be a matter of helping us with those fixes for some of those pathologies. So, for example, if we know that it causes significant social harm to have recommender systems that optimize for engagement, but we still think that there are good reasons to have recommender systems, and as to why, I'll talk about that later. We might still we then want to know, what are we actually optimizing for? What are the goals that we should be aiming at? Okay, that's where having an ideal is going to be important. Actually, Arvind is organizing a workshop at the Knight Foundation in Columbia with Katie Bass in April, which is titled Optimizing for What? Right? We want to articulate these positive goals, so it's valuable there. It's valuable as well when you face trade-offs, and you want to know, you've got these you've got your different methods of responding to particular pathologies conflict with one another. Knowing, having a currency to cash them out in terms of how they advance your positive ideal can help you make that trade-off. And then it's going to be valuable also for guiding what you can do in order to achieve those goals. So there's a just war theorist called Paul Ramsey. That was my thing before. My PhD was on just war theory. Paul Ramsey has this really nice kind of aphorism about the ethics of war, what justifies limits. Okay. Really dense 3 words of philosophy there. And the basic idea of it is just that the nature of the goal that you're aiming at conditions the means that can permissibly be used to achieve it. And in particular, for our purposes here, we're going to find that the nature of the goal that we're aiming at will condition our answers to the how and the who questions that I described yesterday. So remember, those are the questions of procedural legitimacy and proper authority. The nature of the good is going to have an effect on our answers to those questions. So I think we need a theory of something good to aim at in designing the digital public sphere. And look, that's the task of political philosophy. Great, there's a role for us. So what are we going to do? What do we offer? What can you do if you're going to the shelf and you're trying to find out what are the ready-made solutions? Where can we just add algorithms and stir and have a fix? So my sense is that the resources of political philosophy, as we currently have them, are not brilliantly suited to the task. And I think this is mainly because political philosophy is focused on justifying the extrinsic power of the state. Again, like I said yesterday, that's been its central focus. So it's really focused on when it's permissible for the state to limit speech. And then the positive idea just comes out of that. As I said in the intro, what you do is you protect people's basic rights to freedom of expression. You allow unmediated interaction. And then from that, it's like those old sort of jokes about startups and profit. Step 6, step 7, and then step 8, profit. Somehow it spontaneously emerges, right? The healthy digital public sphere will just come about. And then the value of the digital public sphere is grounded in those two things. It's grounded in the fact that you're protecting rights to freedom of expression. That's the sort of the fundamental core. And then on top of that, you're creating a public sphere that is conducive to democracy. So I think there's sort of all sorts of ways in which this is inadequate for our purposes. I think that it doesn't have the effects, the spontaneous emergence doesn't happen anymore. I think that the underlying values are not quite the right sort of values to be the center of our focus. I think it doesn't answer the central question we need to answer. So let me explain each of those points in turn. So first of all, it's now pretty well established that merely protecting freedom of speech online does not generate a healthy digital public sphere. That ideal from John Stuart Mill, I don't know if it was ever plausible, maybe it was never plausible, but it certainly isn't plausible now. And there's lots of papers that show this. One by Tim Wu, is the First Amendment obsolete? The basic idea is that by allowing everybody to express themselves when there's so much, when it's so kind of cheap to express yourself, you enable a kind of flooding or silencing of people who express certain types of views. So speech can be weaponized. There's a really great overview of this debate, by the way, in one of the last chapters of Rob's book, System Error. So that's the kind of the empirical case. There was this sort of empirical assumption at the heart of the standard account of like how we think about the public sphere in political philosophy, and it seems to be false. What about the normative assumptions? Well, I think there's a risk in tethering the value of the digital public sphere so closely to democracy. Like, definitely it's important for democracy, and definitely, like, the account that I'm going to defend in a minute is a democratic account in spirit. But I worry about tying its value so closely to it, again, largely because of this point about there being so many reasons for democracy being in peril. And I think it enables a kind of shifting of responsibility. And we've seen this with some of the platforms. So, there's this Medium post by Nick Clegg, the VP for Global Affairs for Meta. You and the algorithm, it takes two to tango. And one of the arguments that he advances in order to sort of mitigate Meta's responsibility for various different social harms is essentially that democracy is in peril from all fronts. What could a little old us be doing, against this sort of tide of what Cory Doctorow could call the sort of enshittification of democracy? It's happening everywhere, and from so many different causes. Don't come at us, right? And I think that can also lead to a kind of defeatism. I mean, if ultimately what you're trying to achieve is to sort of realize these instrumental benefits to democracy, and democracy is deeply imperiled, then that might lead to just not even trying. So focusing only on its value for democracy, I think, is also a mistake. But there's even a more fundamental problem with focusing on kind of rights to freedom of expression as being at the foundation of our sort of normative account of how we should shape communication and distribute attention. And this is fundamentally that we're not dealing here with whether or not people can express themselves. We're not necessarily dealing with their expressive interests. What we're focusing on is whether they can communicate with a certain audience. So take the Trump case today. Like, Facebook's or Meta's decision to allow him back onto the platform wasn't about enabling him to express himself. He's been expressing himself up a storm on Truth Social. It's just that fewer people have been paying attention to it. What they're actually controlling, what they're shaping, is the distribution of attention. And the forms in which Trump can communicate when he goes onto Twitter, he's going to have to fit himself back into 280 characters, which he doesn't on Truth Social. But they're not shaping his ability to express himself. So in a way, there's this focus on freedom of speech and on free expression. It slightly misses the point. It doesn't get at the key thing. How do we shape public communication, and how do we distribute attention? I think what we're really looking at here is not expressive interests as the foundation. We're looking at communicative interests. So instead of thinking about this in terms of freedom of expression, I think that we need a theory of communicative justice, which will help us to think about how to shape public communication and how to distribute attention. I take the name communicative justice from some brilliant work by Sita Penya Gangadaran, actually again in a edited volume edited by Rob, and she draws in turn on Iris Marion Young's work, her book Inclusion and Democracy, which is a must-read, I think, for anyone interested in these things. And I think when you're developing your theory of communicative justice, you want to give an account of how it matters in its own right, not only because it's instrumental to democracy. Okay, so that's what I'm going to do in the rest of the paper. The rest of the paper is going to be an attempt to sort of to defend the idea that we need a theory of communicative justice and to give you a particular picture of communicative justice, what it looks like. I want to be clear that this is my primary goal here is to articulate the need for a theory of communicative justice and to give you an account of the sort of shape it should have. I have my own theory. I'll call it a democratic egalitarian theory. In many ways, it's a stalking horse. I anticipate it's going to improve and grow even from the questions and certainly from the comments discussed today and tomorrow. But the idea is to sort of, first of all, to primarily motivate this as a category that we need to pay attention to and that we need to populate, and then hopefully generate a bunch of other examples for it. So first of all, let's start by just explaining why I'm talking about communicative justice. Like, why is it we need a theory of justice here? It's easy to kind of multiply varieties of justice. It's a bit of a trend. I've already done two: predictive justice and communicative justice. So you need to motivate that kind of that approach. Why is it a matter of justice? So I think that questions of justice arise paradigmatically, canonically, when you have a bunch of moral equals who are seeking to realize a set of individual and collective goods that require them to coordinate, cooperate, restrain themselves, hold back, and that when everything works, will realize some sort of benefit that can be distributed among them in various different ways, and will also involve various different burdens. And I think that the goal of a theory of justice is to tell you how to promote those individual and collective goods in such a way that you respect the moral equality of the people who are generating. This is, in a way, you could use this as a way of describing Rawls's approach to justice, but I think it's much more general. And I think that's a pretty good description of the task facing those governing the digital public sphere. This phenomenon of collective attention that is enabled by the internet, essentially, and of mass communication. So being able to communicate with vast numbers of people at a time, being able to connect with one another across the world in this way. This is something that is a sort of cooperative surplus. It's something that we generate together. It's something that requires restraint and sort of coordination and collective action in order to achieve it. And it's something that involves different benefits and burdens. Okay, I'm going to talk about what some of those are later. So I think this is a good candidate for investing a theory of justice. And I think that the structure of such a theory should basically have two parts. One should be that it should identify the individual and collective interests that you're aiming to pursue, in this case, communicative interests. And two should be that it should identify the norms by which these goods are distributed and by which they can be realized. Okay? So those are the two elements. If you're developing a theory of communicative justice, you want to bring up an alternative theory to mine, give an account of what the relevant interests are, and give an account of the norms by which they can be promoted. Those are the two key elements. So my approach, I'm going to call a democratic egalitarian theory of communicative justice. That's going to be just my sort of way of capturing the three values that I appealed to yesterday when I was giving my sort of the background theoretical account. The values of liberty, equality, collective self-determination. In the paper, I go into in detail the ways in which these motivate each of the different things that I argue for. In order to kind of cover more ground, I'm going to leave those foundations to one side during the talk. But the ultimate, the way you should think of them is like, okay, so relational equality is fundamentally about standing in equal social relations with people, not having hierarchy. Liberty is about, in my view, at the very least, sort of avoiding the risk of wrongful interference by others. Collective self-determination is the idea that we should democratically decide which values we're governed by. So those are the things that come together in my democratic egalitarian theory. But like I said, I'm mainly trying to motivate the category as a whole. Okay, so what are the interests that shaping public communication and distributing attention serves? So what are communicative interests? There is a really rich set of possibilities here. I'm going to just go right through the individual and collective interests that I think are most salient. I'm going to start with non-instrumental individual interests, then instrumental individual interests, and then I'm going to go on to collective goods. Okay, so among the non-instrumental individual interests in communication, it starts out with something very basic, which is just the fact of being recognized, being attended to. Like, communicating is when you express yourself and someone pays attention. Lacking the attention, you're expressing yourself and no one's paying attention. There's a misrecognition. There's an absence of recognition of the person speaking. That's a very sort of minimal element. Beyond that, communication, when it's working well, realizes a kind of equality between people. Okay, so it's one of the ways in which we can express our equality with one another that goes beyond just sort of like non-interference, but we can kind of positively express it. That's important. Beyond just the kind of mere recognition of being acknowledged and sort of egalitarian treatment, there's also the esteem involved in paying effortful attention to something, like, for example, what you guys are doing right now, and which I'm very grateful for. That fact of actually giving people your attention, paying attention to a long, complicated talk about the philosophy of the digital public sphere, that's an incredibly valuable communicative interest of mine that's being filled there. So thank you. In a way, I think the highest kind of value with respect to communicative interest is something that will hopefully come in the comments and in the Q&A. It's the joint action of a vibrant conversation. And that thing has intrinsic value too, has non-instrumental value too. Those are the key, I think, non-instrumental interests, just in the act of communication. But there are also obviously many, many, many instrumental interests. Communication is how we get everything else. And sort of, in a way, trying to sum these up is a bit arbitrary. There's so many things that we gain and get through communication. I'm just going to give you three sort of broad headings. Obviously, information, that's kind of very clear, but it also can't be overstated. Our informational interests are served by communication. Coordination and collective action, our ability to come together around something, depends on our ability to communicate with one another, to the degree that for some people this is kind of the foundation for them placing communication at the sort of heart of their ethical theories. That's true for Habermas, it's true for one aspect of Philip Pettit's metaethics. But that's a kind of an essential function of communication. It's instrumental value to us in being able to coordinate with one another. And then another aspect that has become really prominent in work over the last sort of 30 years on how various different minority communities have used online platforms to come together is the formation of collective identity and sense of community. So Andre Brock's work on Black Twitter, for example, is a really good discussion of this. This is not intended to be an exhaustive list. It's intended to give you a picture of the kind of interest that we're aiming to promote. So those are the individual communicative interests. There are also collective ones. And the fact they're collective is going to become important, especially later. The primary collective interest I'm going to focus on is civic robustness. Okay, so what do I mean by this? Here I'm drawing on a tradition that goes back to, goes back beyond, but I'm drawing in particular on John Dewey. That's the quote at the top of the handout, like that. In his book, The Public and Its Problems, 100 years ago, he argued that a public emerges when private actors take supposedly private decisions, they have negative externalities that affect other people, and then those other people have to come together in order to resist and to hold that person to account and make them internalize those costs. So it was a sort of a reactive idea of how communities come together in response to the harmful actions of private actors. I have just three little notes on this. I think that it's not just about responding to externalities. I think it's about responding to power, and in particular to governing power. That's where I think we especially need what I'll call civic publics. And governing power is not something that only arises at the level of the state. It also includes, transnational governing power. And I think that, an interesting feature of the way in which digital platforms work is that they have actually been very good platforms for mobilizing against the power of those tech companies themselves. So that's an example of sort of civic publics emerging in response to a kind of governing power. It also operates at the sub-state level. So universities, for example, are a type of community, they're not the same as the state, where you still need sort of this civic response to governing power. So it's not only about it's not only about responding to externalities, it's responding to governing power. It's not only about responding to the state, it's also about responding to transnational and subnational power. And it's not only reactive. Okay? It's not only about responding to power, it's also about laying the discursive foundations for collective action, coming together in such a way that we sufficiently trust one another and we have enough of a sense of what to do that we can act together to achieve some collective goals. So this aspect of the public sphere, this way in which we kind of form democratic publics that articulate ideals that we then hold our representatives to account to realize. That's a really important part of this. It is distinct from just reacting to power. It's also about setting the conditions for power to operate. So I'm going to say that a public sphere is civically robust when it supports the creation of civic publics that respond to governing power, kind of wherever it's found. So this goes for at the low level, like at a university, say, or at the state level, at the federal level, globally for transnational power. It's worth pointing out that civic robustness is obviously vital for a healthy democracy, but it doesn't only matter because of its contribution to democracy. Like, it matters even in those, in those non-democratic contexts, like subnational and transnational. And it matters, it's independently valuable, it's valuable in its own right, separately from how it contributes to the democracies that it realizes. It's important because it's a kind of egalitarian bottom-up power that can be resorted to when other institutions fail. Right? So that's the thing that makes it attractive, is that we're subject to the power of those who govern us. This is a way for us to come together and both hold them to account and also set a course of action for them to take. So these are the three kind of categories of goods that we should be trying to promote when realizing communicative justice. First, you've got the individual non-instrumental interest, the individual instrumental interest, and then this collective interest in realizing civic robustness. So the starting point for a theory of communicative justice is that you're trying to promote that, and you're doing so subject to respect people's status as moral equal. And this is the first point. That's going to be something that is valuable in its own right. It's not only going to be valuable because of how it realizes democracy. So that's one of the desiderata satisfied. So then what does this actually mean in practice? Like, how do you take the tools of architecture, amplification, and moderation and use them to promote our communicative interests? Well, in a nutshell, it means promoting recognition, equal treatment, esteem, dialogue, knowledge, deliberation, coordination, and community. That all sounds pretty easy, doesn't it? Obviously, the application of these ideas is going to be super hard. I'm going to say a bit about this in a moment. With respect to civic robustness, I think that you promote civic robustness by promoting some subordinate goals. So one of them is a healthy information environment, and that's what we often focus on when we're talking about a healthy digital public sphere. That's clearly important. In order for civic publics to hold power to account, they need to know, how power is being used, what the stakes are. That's clearly true. You also need a secure private sphere. And this is something sort of counterintuitive, comes from, I get it from Habermas, but the idea just being that you can't kind of organize and form civic publics if you're not able to also communicate privately. This is one reason why signal is such an important public good. The third step is you need to be able to allocate collective attention so the public can find itself. The quote that I gave at the beginning of the handout, which I didn't read out, but Dewey says something like, we have the means of communication like we've never had them before, but the public is unable to find itself, sort of formless and shadowy and spasmodic, because we're not able to kind of draw our attention to the same things. Right? That focusing of our collective attention on a unique problem or on a single problem, that is a crucial part of formulating civic publics. And then lastly, you need, for the way in which we communicate, to meet certain minimal standards at the very least that are consistent with a certain degree of trust and sort of commitment to cooperate and collaborate. Sometimes we talk about kind of aiming for values in the digital public sphere that are kind of realize a sort of higher level of civility than that, kind of some sort of positive norms of argument and dialogue. And like that would be desirable in many ways, but it isn't the sort of the minimum required for civic robustness, I think. It's just that you trust people enough and you tolerate them well enough that you're prepared to kind of abide by the result of whatever kind of the end, the way in which you're going to make the decision at the end is going to be. And obviously that's something that is kind of breaking down significantly here in the United States at the moment. So all of this means that if you're trying to promote all of these goals, then you have to evaluate communications for quality. And that's going to be kind of where most of the action in the theory of communicative justice is going to come. Like, how do you do that, right? One way you could do that is to allow people to judge for themselves what's in their communicative interest. That's in general a way. If you've got a sense of something being good for people that you want to distribute, then you're like, well, what's really good for you? You go back to some sort of market-style solution where people are able to express their own preferences. The problem with that is twofold. One is that in these contexts, in the digital public sphere, where people are kind of allocating their attention among a sort of functionally infinite amount of information, you're always deciding for them what they're going to choose from. So even if you're responding to their preferences, you're always doing a certain sort of act of filtering first and selection, which is then giving them something to choose between. If you do that, if you operationalize that by predicting what people are going to want, then that's where you get the precise problems that we have right now. Like, that's effectively what recommender systems have done for the last 12 years. They've predicted what are people most likely to click as a way of expressing their revealed preferences? And that has left us in the mess that we're in. So we need to do something other than that. But that doesn't mean that we should just kind of go out and promote whatever we think is the most valuable, are the most valuable communication simpliciter. And certainly not that Facebook should just be doing that. This is where the democratic egalitarian part of the project comes in. It's not just about promoting communicative interests in a way that a consequentialist might, for example. It's about doing so in a democratic egalitarian way. So what would that mean? So here, the architecture that I brought in last night can be wheeled out again. So remember my what, how, and who question. What question is substantive justification. I talked in particular about neutrality as a goal for substantive justification. The how question refers to procedural legitimacy. The who question refers to proper authority. Who gets to exercise power? So let's start with the what question. The first step is going to be establish a baseline for acceptable communication. In some ways, so this is the moderation part. In some ways, it's going to be not necessarily that different from debates that we've already had in the past about limits of free speech. There is a difference. The difference is that you're not determining whether people can express themselves when you remove them from a platform. You're determining instead whether they get attention. So the stakes are somewhat lower for that reason. But it's still true, I think, that we have communicative rights grounded in, especially relational equality, to participate in civic publics that are relevant. The reality is that Donald Trump does have some kind of a right to participate in the digital public sphere or the civic publics that are relevant to the governance of the country that he lives in. And that's still something that provides a sort of a ground for being cautious about restriction. So you can't just go around kind of banning people on a whim. You can't just say, look, all we're doing here is we're just not listening to you, and you don't have a right that we listen to you. There is a right to participate in civic publics of which you have a claim to be part. We also have a much wider array of interventions available to us than we had in the case of thinking about sort of banning of speech in sort of the pre-internet age. And this actually came out a lot in the norms that were being promulgated around Trump's being reinstated. It said not only are we going to remove certain communications, we're also going to reduce their distribution. We're going to prevent links from being shared. We're going to not recommend them within our recommender systems. Like, we have all of those other tools available to us besides just restriction. And so that's going to mean that restriction is going to be kind of a necessary tool less frequently. So there are these subtle differences from the ways in which we've articulated these debates about free speech before. But I think as far as moderation goes, it's on sort of similar terrain. For me, the more interesting question philosophically is how do we handle the shaping communication and distributing attention part of it, where we go beyond just policing boundaries. The starting point is that you want to try to realize egalitarian social relations on the platform. Okay, so you want to get that goal of communicating with one another as equal. And this is going to give you reason to reduce and disincentivize manipulation, deception, and abuse. It will also mean creating opportunities for people to participate in relevant civic publics and then governing them in ways that can't be exploited by some to abuse others. So a really interesting example of this, I might have mentioned yesterday, was the when Elon Musk takes over Twitter, and then he says, it's a really big priority for him to crack down on CSAM, despite the fact that he'd fired many of the people who were responsible for monitoring CSAM on Twitter. And then what folks on the right did was basically just flag any left-wing account or any prominent left-wing account and make accusations that they were involved in the distribution of CSAM, which is child sexual abuse material, for those who don't know. So this was a way of governing that did not create egalitarian social relations among people. It created a tool that some people could use to dominate others. Right? So that's not consistent with communicative justice. Beyond just aiming for egalitarian social relations, it's also true that when you're distributing attention and you're shaping public communication, you're generating these benefits and burdens, and you've got to distribute the benefits and burdens fairly. That's kind of what makes it communicative justice. So this raises some interesting questions that haven't sort of, I think, been considered in political philosophy around like the distribution of positive collective attention. So the way that platforms are currently designed is a sort of they instantiate the Matthew effect, right? So if you already have a lot of followers, if you're already popular, if you've got 100,000 followers like Arvind, not a mere 4.5 like me, then your communications are prioritized more, and more attention is distributed to them. Not only sort of the organic part that comes from the followers, but also from the platform itself. And so there's an argument that that kind of algorithmic component of the sort of the, if you like, the cooperative surplus of attention should actually be distributed in such a way that that it supports a kind of fair equality of opportunity for positive attention. And in a way, one could say that this is a feature of the TikTok algorithm to a certain degree, the way in which it enables kind of more people to gain more followers, and it kind of is able to identify people who pick them up from out of nowhere and suddenly make them famous. That's actually there's like a moral reason for that. Like it's a moral good related to TikTok, which is not something you might have expected to hear tonight. That actually is better approximating that ideal of kind of reversing the Matthew effect when it comes to the distribution of attention. But it's also really important to distribute burdens fairly too. And here, this is one reason why there's value in centralized governance. And this again, you can think about the Twitter Mastodon distinction here. There's a philosopher, Jonathan Flowers, who's done some really good work on the ways in which the shift to Mastodon kind of imposes the costs of content moderation on the communities that are suffering abuse, right? So as a form of decentralized governance, what basically happens is that you on Mastodon, you have your own server, and then your server decides who it's going to defederate from. So you have to kind of police your own neighborhood. So if you are the people who are suffering the greatest amount of abuse, then you're going to have to do more work in order to prevent that, right? And this is obviously unfair. Like the benefits and burdens of online communication shouldn't be distributed in such a way that those who are already bearing the most costs then have to bear further costs in order to prevent them. All right, so I've talked about a lot of kind of governance tasks that face these platforms. And the very glaringly obvious question is, who should have the power to do this, right? And we saw today, like Nick Clegg articulating Mark Zuckerberg's decision to allow Donald Trump back onto a platform where he has, 70 million followers. The power currently resides with these companies. How can that possibly be justified? And how should we think about the ways in which power is exercised and who should have the power to do this? In all of these cases that I've just described, you have to make and impose substantive value judgments. And actually, in the context of the American, I said I wasn't going to talk about the First Amendment and American free speech law, but there's an argument that all of this would involve a kind of viewpoint discrimination. Okay? That it's a way of imposing values of not being neutral on the platform. Okay, so how do we respond to this? First response is that it's unavoidable. So there's no way of not kind of promoting stuff. There's no way of being neutral. Platforms are going to inescapably govern. They can't avoid making and imposing norms, so they better do so in a better way rather than a worse. So in a way, you could argue that the right to govern is grounded in the fact that it's kind of unavoidable that they govern. Second response, that doesn't mean that you can just kind of promote whatever you happen to value. There still needs to be restraint and caution. And here I think we can bring in the concept from John Rawls of primary goods. Like if you are sort of aware of significant disagreement about the things that you're trying to promote, then try to focus on those communicative interests that are going to be valuable for people, whatever else they care about. Right? And it should be valuable for you, whatever else you care about, that you not be manipulated, that you not be deceived. Right? That should be something that is a primary good, and even if it's contentious, can still be justifiably promoted. Okay, so I've said that platforms can't avoid governing, can't avoid getting involved. Maybe you could argue, well, actually, they can just get rid of all the algorithms, right? There's an awful lot of this going around. Let's just not have recommender systems allocating attention online. Let's just not do it. Let's just make the internet a set of content-independent pipes. So I think this is a mistake in a number of ways. Like it's motivated by an ideal of fairness, but it's not actually fair. I live in Australia. It sucks having reverse chronological ordering on Mastodon. Everything happens when I'm asleep, and I wake up and like, what am I going to do? I'm not going to scroll through 8 hours of people talking. It's annoying. So it's not actually fair. It just sort of gives a sort of priority to those who are in similar time zones. But more importantly, it just focuses again on one part of this complex whole for the distribution of attention. It focuses on the algorithm part. It doesn't pay attention to the architecture or to moderation. you're still going to be distributing attention and shaping communication, whether you use recommender systems or not. You're just going to be doing it with one hand tied behind your back. And you're going to be foregoing a really valuable tool that could be used in this case. Like, we shouldn't see like the problem with social media as being that there are recommender systems and algorithms. We should see the problem with social media as being that they've been optimizing for engagement and for profit. Like, we could align them to different kinds of values, then we'd be able to actually get the benefits that they pose. Right? So we'd be able to actually direct collective attention. And so we wouldn't have to leave the public, shadowy and formless, seeking spasmodically for itself, but seizing and holding its shadow rather than its substance, as Dewey said. I think there's a better response to the impossibility of neutrality than just sort of ditching our ability to intervene successfully. And that's to aim for proper authority, to aim for democratic authority. But what would that actually look like here? And again, right now we're seeing big clashes about this play out in India, with interference in platform governance there by the state, and here in America, the Texas case against Facebook around its content moderation policies. There are really interesting questions about like whether it's better to have democratic states interfere and sort of set the norms of communicative justice for these platforms. And like my inclination is definitely favor democratic authorization, but then at the same time, the state is the most powerful entity that there is, and the role of civic robustness is primarily, or one of the central roles of it, is to hold the state to account. So if the state is able to interfere with and shape the distribution of attention and the nature of public communication, then you're tying your hands in response to the most central power there is. So I think that's like a good reason to be sort of reserved about kind of direct control by states. But then obviously also, like, it's not like things are great on the other side. Platforms are obviously poorly positioned to govern effectively. Their motives are all over the place. They're optimizing for profit. They also they're political actors themselves. More often, I think you find them actually aligning with states and against people than you do finding them serving as a sort of a bulwark or a bastion, a standard bearer for the people. We see that a lot with copyright law, for example. So private enforcement of public norms is really bad. The way that they've enforced copyright through digital platforms doing it themselves kind of radically extends the scope of copyright law as a means of reducing platform liability, but then really significantly reducing what we're able to do with content that we otherwise own. So there are big reasons to think that the existing platforms can't serve the role of governing the digital public sphere successfully. And I don't have like a sort of an answer that I can just roll out. I think that there would need to be creative institutional design. I only have a couple of naive thoughts that I think are worth articulating. The first one is that much of the pathology here comes from the motivation to keep people on platform as long enough so you can extract as much data as possible, be able to then serve them adverts that are aimed at influencing them based on what is known about them. So the practice of surveillance advertising is kind of at the core of what's wrong here, and I think we have pretty much no reason not to outlaw it. So I think that we've slipped into this world where it just seems normal that this is okay. There's so many other reasons why it's problematic. I think that getting rid of surveillance advertising would make some significant difference. And second, the way in which platforms, or the reason for which platforms optimize for short-term engagement, is because it's profitable for them to do so. But it's only profitable, it's only economically rational, because they're able to externalize the costs of doing so. It's quite similar to the economic case for using fossil fuels. It's only economically rational to use fossil fuels because you don't have to bear the costs of doing so. They go on to everybody else. So in the same way as with fossil fuels, the right response here is to make those who bear the profits also bear the costs. Okay, so that's the next sort of step that would need to be taken. I think that in the world where we are right now, platforms, they don't have democratic authorization for doing this in a way that I would like them to have, but they're the only ones who can actually govern. And I think in that context, it's reasonable to try and sort of establish a certain kind of authority just through governing kind of responsibly, aiming at the right things, and in ways that are procedurally legitimate. So I think that's kind of all you can do, but we definitely need much more creative institutional design. That brings me on to my last substantive point about procedural legitimacy. And we have this in spades from today's decision about Trump. We have it in spades from the oversight board every time they make a decision. This idea that you can kind of bootstrap the right to govern by following the right procedures. One simple point that I want to make is just that we've often focused in this context on analogizing content moderation in particular to sort of due process, individual rights of due process. And I think that looking at things through the lens of communicative justice actually sort of nudges us away from that individualized focus towards something more systemic. And I think this has interesting implications at the regulatory level and at the technology design level as well. So, I've talked about civic robustness. That's a collective good. I mentioned the healthy information environment. That's something that is also a collective good. I didn't talk about collective and stochastic harms, but they're also an interesting part of this. So collective and stochastic harms are basically instances where a large number of communications take place, none of which itself is sufficient to cause harm, but where collectively either they actually are harmful collectively, or else they make a certain harm highly probable. Okay, that's something, again, you need to address at the collective level with sort of potentially with algorithmic reduction techniques. And I think that this all suggests that the goal of communicative justice has these important kind of systemic elements to it. And so when we're thinking about how we regulate and how we design recommender systems for the digital public sphere, we also need to be aiming to optimize at that global level rather than just the local level. And technically, this makes for an interesting question for those of you who work in recommender systems. The standard model, as I understand it, for recommender systems is to optimize locally, to figure out for this person, what is the thing that they're most likely to click on, given their past and given what you know about them. What's going to optimize for a particular index of satisfaction with respect to this person. What we should really be doing is thinking about how they have systemic effects and how we optimize for that within the models themselves. But it also has interesting implications on the regulatory level. And it's one of the reasons why I'm a little skeptical about this notion, which has been actually first advanced here in Stanford, that we're going to solve the problems with social media by creating a market for recommender systems, this idea of middleware that Francis Fukuyama has promoted, among others. That, again, is another form of local optimization. It's relying on individual consumer preferences to solve these collective problems. I think that it's, I'm sure there are ways in which there will be an improvement on where we are now, but again, it doesn't satisfy the demands of communicative justice. Okay, so there's a lot there, I know. The big project, the paper's 23,000 words, and there's a lot more to do on it, I'm sure. So I'm just going to summarize what I've done before turning over to Arvid. So first claim was that algorithmic intermediaries govern the digital public sphere. Architecture, amplification, moderation. We want to know how to do it better, but existing political theories focus on the wrong interests, expressive interests rather than communicative interests, and they only tell us how to set boundaries for permissible speech and allow the digital public sphere to emerge spontaneously from those. We need to actually know how to shape communication and distribute attention. For that, we need a theory of communicative justice. I gave you one theory. I gave an account of the communicative interests that should be promoted and of the democratic egalitarian norms that it could be, that they should be constrained by, their promotion should be constrained by. I've argued that in one sense, the way all these concerns about whether or not social media is causing harm to democracy is a bit of a red herring, because actually realizing communicative justice matters in its own right. Okay, so we should care about that independently. I argued that while it's good for authority to govern the digital public sphere to come from a democratic source, it can, if necessary, be justified pro tem on grounds of capacity, as long as that's married with restraint. And I've given this sort of thought about how the collective nature of communicative justice means that we should be thinking at the systemic level when we're trying to distribute attention and shape communication in the digital public sphere. The aim, as I said, was to provide a schema for a broader account, for an account of communicative justice, to motivate the category and to invite people to suggest sort of alternative accounts of what are the interests and what are the norms. And then more broadly to illustrate the necessity of making first-order progress in political philosophy in order to understand how to realize justified governance in the algorithmic system. So with that, I'll turn over.
Arvind. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? It's a pleasure to be here, and I really mean that. This week, for the first time in 3 years, I got on a plane. I had passed up many important conferences and events, but when Rob asked if I could comment on Seth's lecture, I thought that opportunity was too good to pass up. I'd read Seth's previous work on platforms, and I thought it was brilliant. And I've learned a lot from this week's lectures. And also, I should say the exchange yesterday was really wonderful. So thank you, Ariel. And by the way, listening to your comment, I learned that the comment is supposed to be a critique. So now I'm going to tell Seth what I really think. I'm just kidding. But in seriousness, I've already cited your draft paper more than once in different things that I'm writing. So I'm really looking forward to it coming out. And I would encourage everyone to check out the paper when it comes out. It really goes into a lot of depth, more than was possible for Seth to get into in an hour. And so Seth says in his paper that his aim is to introduce an overarching theory of communicative justice and not to apply it to specific cases. I think that's perfect for a philosopher. Maybe as a mere computer scientist, I can do some of that lesser work of applying it, or at least, get a start on that in the next 20 minutes or so. And like Seth did, I'm going to focus my attention on social media platforms. Seth's scope is grand, and his theory applies to all kinds of things. He mentioned infrastructure like AWS and Cloudflare, and even operating systems. Maybe, but I'll focus on social media today. But also maybe set a little bit of a thought experiment. I haven't done this, but let's say you were to do a find and replace in your paper and changed all the instances of algorithmic intermediary to operating system. Would your paper still be as profound? I'm not sure. And if that's not the case, maybe consider reducing the scope a little bit. Just a suggestion. Okay, so let's start at the beginning, all the way back in 2006, early days of social media. This was when Facebook introduced the newsfeed. I don't know what people even did before that. I think you were supposed to go to each one of your friends' profile pages and then scan to see if they had changed anything, like an idiot. Anyway, so the feed is the quintessential defining feature of social media. We take that for granted today. Does anyone remember what was the reaction when Facebook introduced the newsfeed? Outrage, yes. Outrage, an apology from Zuckerberg, a temporary backtracking, the usual cycle that we've seen many times. But why? So back then, this was framed as a privacy issue, and that's certainly a big part of it. But I think there is even more fundamental. The newsfeed represented Facebook's big shift from a platform that was for expression to a platform that was for communication. From a platform that was a place for you to put information about yourself to a platform that got in the way of who saw whose updates and who communicated with whom. And that was one of the central themes of Seth's lecture and his essay. And I want to further highlight his distinction because I think that's an absolutely critical one. So the newsfeed is the kind of thing that, as Seth said, shapes public communication and reconfigures our social relations. So there are normative implications of that, and I think we understand that at an intuitive level, hence the outrage. And I would say that as an outsider to philosophy, I find moral and political philosophy most useful when it takes these moral intuitions that we have and puts it on a firm normative footing, and sometimes tells us that we actually need to update our intuitions. And I think your paper is a brilliant example of the first kind of thing, and I think it's that's one thing I really love about it. But as Seth talks about, it's taken pretty long for scholars to explicitly recognize and formalize this shift. Yeah, I'm not sure why that is. One reason could be kind of like the boiling frog analogy. This has happened over a period of a decade or more in a number of small steps. I exaggerated a little bit earlier. The newsfeed is only one of many, many steps that turned social media and the internet in general from a medium for expression to a medium for communication. The very fundamental move of social networks, which is that we bring our offline social relationships into the online world, that already is a step in the direction towards a communication medium from an expressive medium. And then there was the newsfeed, and then there was the like button. Yes, there was a world before the like button. It's hard to remember now. And then the shift from a chronological to an algorithmic feed. I could go on, but I think you get the point. The point is that social media today has reshaped our communication patterns and reconfigured our social relations, and it has done that in a way that we're not happy with. And so before we can fix that, we have to understand why it's broken, and Seth's paper does that in a wonderful way. I think the core idea is just really simple. It's worth reiterating that. Platforms allocate our attention. Whenever someone in a position of power allocates a resource, they have to do it in a way that's just. I think if people in the tech industry could be convinced of this, I think the consequences could be enormous. I might be naive, but I'm still a believer in the possibility that tech workers collectively, by being able to exercise power based on their convictions, can really, to some extent, push back against commercial interests. So I think that's important. I think it's important for this message to get out there. Another important thing that Seth says is It's not enough for platforms to merely fix pathologies. They need to work toward a positive goal. I thought this was one of the most important points of the lecture. But if you talk to platform developers today, I'm pretty sure that most of them would explicitly reject this being a goal. And that is to answer the question, what is YouTube for, or what is Facebook for, or what is any platform for? They would say it's for whatever you want to use it for, subject to our rules. And I think that's also a politically very convenient position to take because they're already under attack from all sides for supposedly being biased. Right, so that's the current mentality. And the mentality is to mitigate certain specific harms, whether it's incitement to violence, child sexual abuse material, and to be neutral toward all content except for those categories. That's the content moderation mentality. Seb talks about how platform developers, in fact, fetishize neutrality, even though neutrality is, in fact, impossible to achieve. What I would have actually liked to see is an even stronger argument for the impossibility of neutrality. And I know, Seb, this can feel a little bit boring to do when many scholars previously have done that. Charles Lynn Gillespie, Daphne Keller have done so eloquently. And the more general point that technology is not value neutral, that's a whole genre that's as old as the hills. But I think to be able to change behavior in the tech industry, it's helpful to keep making this argument over and over again. And specifically, I think it would be useful to review the empirical evidence showing how neutrality has failed on its own terms. Neutrality reifies social hierarchies and can sometimes amplify social inequalities, as Marion explained yesterday. And it rewards those who are most willing to hack the engagement optimization algorithm. Yeah, platform developers know this. They call it engagement bait. All platforms have filters for trying to exclude engagement bait, but they only catch the most egregious stuff. In a way, the default mode of participation or self-presentation on social media is engagement bait. That's what we all do all the time, and there's no filter for that. What I mean is that the self that we bring to social media is the self that we think that the algorithm will reward, and that, I think, is the core failure of the neutrality ideal, and I think that's worth highlighting. By the way, why do I keep harping on reaching engineers? If you were to look at the press reporting about the Facebook files, the documents leaked by whistleblower Frances Haugen, you might reasonably come away with the conclusion that people working at these companies are callous and there's not really a way to change behavior except through law. And I thought that too, until I actually spent some quality time with those original documents rather than the press reporting. And as a result of that, I actually came away with quite a different impression, at least as far as I could see. The people who were represented in those documents were really trying to take their ethical responsibilities seriously. And although, of course, obviously, the business model to some extent constrains what they can do. Nonetheless, I think if you could get platform developers to internalize the content of these lectures, I think that would be enormous. To convince them that they're building the algorithmic city, and they have an affirmative obligation to figure out what the good life is in the algorithmic city, and to design towards that. I think that would be pretty amazing. But there's a big problem that Seth didn't mention with this goal of getting platforms to commit to any kind of positive ideal. The positive goal that Seth wants these intermediaries to have is to function as a healthy digital public sphere, as we just heard. And the rest of his framework of communicative justice flows from this goal that he articulated. But if we were to be honest, the vast majority of what's on these platforms is entertainment content, right? All this digital public sphere stuff, right? Social movements, holding power to account, that's a small sliver of it. And in addition to that, platforms also carry cultural products, music, art, religious content, pretty much every type of speech. I think of this as a kind of domain collapse. It's very similar to the context collapse that you alluded to. And my hypothesis is that as long as platforms fundamentally are going to mix together content from every sphere of life, I don't think it's possible that they can feasibly commit to any single ideal. So I'd be curious what you think about that. By the way, one example of a platform that does have a positive goal is LinkedIn. Right? And if I were to articulate what that goal is, it is to help people advance in their careers or to make the labor market more efficient and that sort of thing. But what it takes to have that positive goal and for that to be coherent is to design around that and to a large extent exclude the types of content that don't fit toward that goal. Right? And so perhaps in that sense, for most of the major social media platforms, the horse has already left the barn. Okay. So I hope it's clear that there are these big design differences between platforms, and those differences have normative implications. So you can't take the same theory and apply it in the same way across all of these platforms. In particular, I want to do this as a computer scientist. I want to identify what it is about platforms in terms of their design, in terms of their technical features, that even gives rise to this demand for communicative justice. I think that would be perhaps a useful exercise. And I want to argue that communicative justice demands apply to different degrees to different platforms. And if we want to influence platforms to change, we have to be attentive to these differences. Otherwise, we risk barking up the wrong tree. Okay, here's an example. On TikTok, as you know, there are many trends and challenges that go viral all the time. Two such challenges that you may or may not have heard about are the blackout challenge and the skull breaker challenge. It's pretty much what it sounds like. The blackout challenge is hold your breath and see if you can pass out. The skull breaker challenge is trip up an unsuspecting person and see if you can get them to fall on their head. And yes, both of these have led to the deaths of children. It's horrible, horrible stuff. And I hope we share a moral intuition that TikTok, in this case, bears some responsibility for allowing this content to spread and for targeting it to children. So the reason I'm bringing this up is to contrast this with, let's say there's a web host and an internet service provider that allows people to put up a web page, and someone put up a web page saying, hey kids, try holding your breath and see if you can pass out. So in that case, I don't think we would think that the same moral obligation is triggered. So I want to ask the question, what's the difference? And I think the answer is perhaps, can illuminate something. So from a technical perspective, I think there are three fundamental modes in which platforms can choose to propagate content. Number one, and this is the oldest model, is the subscription model. This is like Substack or RSS feeds, if anyone even remembers that. You subscribe to a bunch of blogs or newsletters, and that's what gets into your inbox. So that's the first model. The second model is what I call the network model, and this is traditional social networks. People can post stuff, but the critical thing is that other people can repost it or reshare it or whatever it is, and that enables content to go viral. And it is this core capability that gives social platforms many of the benefits as well as harms that we associate with them. The third model is the algorithmic model. In the algorithmic model, the information that reaches you is the information that the algorithm has predicted you're most likely to engage with. And historically, most of these social platforms have been moving in the direction of the algorithmic model, but TikTok in particular has embraced an almost purely algorithmic model from the very beginning. You can follow other accounts on TikTok, but that's not really the point. So there is these three models, and actually four if you include a zeroth model, which is purely web host or something that's purely tailored toward your expressive interests. That's number 0. And then there's subscription, which is Substack or blogs. And then there's network, which is traditional social networks. And all the way over here is algorithmic recommendations like TikTok. So my point is that as you move through this list, you can see some trends. The platform starts to take a more and more active role in reshaping communication, the kind of thing that brings up the concern that Seth talked about. And to a greater and greater degree, the value proposition of the platform, the way the platform makes revenue, comes from its ability to redirect attention rather than from the function of purely allowing people to express themselves. And for all these reasons, the platforms on this side of the spectrum also have more power to intervene to limit the spread of harmful speech because they can tweak the algorithm, for example. So I claim that the further a platform is along the spectrum, the more of an obligation it has to ensure communicative justice. I'm fully with you, Seth, that we shouldn't, demonize recommender systems. Recommender systems are not the problem, but having a recommender system, I claim, elevates the platform on this ladder of responsibility. And so every time a platform makes a move, like going from a chronological to an algorithmic feed that moves it on this side of the spectrum, then we have to start to hold platforms to a higher standard. This is not a complete analysis. There are other features that matter, but this is illustrative. And I think to fully complete your theory, I think we need to get into the technical specifics of platforms. And when I say we need to hold them to a higher standard, I'm talking about civil society. That's what I mean by we. And that brings me to the elephant in this room. How can civil society even bring about this change? What power do we have at all? One obvious answer is pushing for regulation, and I think that's important. But regulation can't be the only answer. So what else? So to answer that, I want to question the widespread assumption, which I think to some extent was reflected in your talk, correct me if I'm wrong, that communicative justice is going to be incompatible with big tech platforms' commercial imperatives. Maybe that's true, but I'm not convinced. The reason I'm not convinced is that, like I was saying before, most of the content on these major platforms is entertainment oriented. All of this, public sphere stuff, that's less than 10% based on the numbers that I've seen. It doesn't even make much revenue, and it generates the vast majority of the negative press for these platforms. And that negative press, certainly in the case of Facebook, but I think also for other platforms, has significantly hurt their bottom line. So I think it can't be the case that it's in platforms' commercial interest to ignore all of these justice obligations. And I don't think they have been ignoring. But if you look at what they've actually been doing to try to improve things, I think the reason they've been failing is that they don't have a good handle on what to actually do. The Wall Street Journal recently reported that in 2021, Mark Zuckerberg decided that he'd had enough of all the negative press due to politics on Facebook, and basically issued a decree that Facebook wanted to get out of politics altogether, demote all politics content. That was kind of a nuclear option. This story didn't get more attention. That I was really amazed to see that. And so apparently they tried implementing that. What happened was it backfired. It had exactly the opposite effect. The way they implemented it, when they tried to demote all politics, mainstream news sources took a big hit in their distribution, and things like InfoWars started to fill their place. So they had to backtrack from this plan. The lesson that I take from this, and many other efforts by social media companies to try to fix these problems, and then ending up failing, is that the primary reason that platforms haven't gotten around to implementing communicative justice is that they just don't know how. And I think the business model is also part of it, but that's less of a reason. It's not preclusive. And so I think that's why I'm optimistic about the next generation of tech workers who are going to be entering these companies, who have been thinking carefully about these moral and political questions from day one. So I think there's a lot of room for change. Now, I'm certainly not suggesting that we should put our hopes entirely on big tech platforms to change their ways. We should definitely be exploring alternatives. In that vein, I want to briefly talk about two systems, Reddit and Mastodon. Not in the sense of general competitors for big tech platforms, but specifically the question of, can these or perhaps other platforms take on this role of the digital public sphere, which is clearly very important, but which the big platforms are not providing in a healthy way. So on Reddit, as you know, conversation is not in one giant network, but is broken into topic-focused subreddits. And subreddits can have a positive ideal, and many of them do, as Seth calls for. So another important difference is that content moderators on Reddit are members of those specific subreddits, and they're not really company employees or contractors as you have in the case of the big platforms. So there's many nice things about this model. Since the moderators are community members, it means that users have a voice. If they don't like the moderation policies or the way it's enforced, they can actually talk to a moderator or maybe even consider becoming a moderator. And another nice property is that it has the separation of functions. The people doing the moderation are different from the people working for the company itself, implementing the algorithms, making the revenue. This means that there is less of a conflict of interest. That's one of the key things that Evelyn Douek calls for in the content moderation and systems thinking paper that Seth also referenced. So I think that's another nice property. And because of this somewhat decentralized nature, each subreddit can set its own moderation policy. I think that's had some good effects. It's led to some healthy experiments with content moderation, and there's even been research that tries to understand the causal effects of different content moderation policies. We've learned a lot from that, and I think there's a lot more to learn. At the same time, it means that there are going to be many subreddits that are havens for some of the most problematic communities on the internet. Things like non-consensual pornography have been rampant on Reddit. These days, Reddit has raised the bar a little bit across all subreddits. It's not quite where it used to be, but it's still pretty far from where the mainstream platforms are. So I think that's really a challenge for a model like Reddit. And another challenge, perhaps, is I wonder if it's going to be able to scale. Reddit is still much smaller than the mainstream platforms if this volunteer content moderation model can scale. The kind of factory model that the big platforms use, it has a lot of disadvantages, but it is much more efficient. So Seth brought up Mastodon. I just wanted to offer a few thoughts there as well. That's it's an even more radically decentralized model. And again, fully agree with you, Seth, that throwing away recommendation algorithms is not the answer at all. And I was disappointed that so far Mastodon by design does not include a recommendation algorithm. I think it's a category mistake to look at the specific problems with engagement optimization and to conclude that all algorithms are bad. But the good news on Mastodon, because it's decentralized, is that you can set up your own server, you can implement a recommendation algorithm, and invite other people to join. There are thousands of Mastodon servers. People can join any server, and like email, all these servers can talk to each other. So, and some people have been doing this. They have been building recommendation algorithms. And what I love about this is that even though I'm not a fan of how Mastodon is set up today with respect to whether it's algorithmic amplification or content moderation, what I love about this is that decentralization is a laboratory for experimentation. And in particular, it can be a laboratory for experimentation with different governance models. And I think we're far from having all the answers, and I think we do need experimentation because of that. So let me end by saying this. It seems to me that in 2023, the grip of big tech over social media is perhaps weaker than it's been at any point in the last decade or so. And so I think it's perfect timing for Seth to tell us how to remake all of this. And I think it's going to be exciting to see what's coming in the next few years. All right, thank you, everyone.
Ask you to join here. We do have a little bit of time for questions, and Seth, as I did yesterday, I'm going to ask you to refrain from engaging directly right now with Arvind's stimulating comments. We will have time for the discussion seminar and possibly here as well. You're welcome, of course, to address a question to Arvind or Seth, and if you raise your hand, I'll bring you a microphone. Yep.
Cool. So I wanted to build on something Arvind mentioned in his remarks, which I thought was kind of missing in Seth's discussion, which is the notion of scale, right? And how does that sort of influence how we think about communicative justice and also the distribution of attention? Because it seems like the account somehow is going to be quite different at different scales. So how do
we do one at a time? Yeah. Yeah, that's fair. I think that it's going to reflect in the nature of the stakes. So I think that you want to be able to provide for, and this sort of speaks to Arvind's point about decentralization as well. You want to be able to provide for a measure of, variety, variation, and sort of opportunities for people to do different things and experiment with different models when it's sufficiently sort of low scale, sort of small enough. And I think there is certainly going to be a point at which the demands of communicative justice do become kind of more pressing because people's interests are more at stake. It's playing more of a central role in contributing to civic robustness. So yeah, I think that will be true. It will be true that the strongest demands will apply at the biggest scale. And for the most part, I have been primarily thinking about that, to be fair. I think this also dovetails with Arvind's point about the different degrees of involvement of different platforms in the ways in which they distribute attention. I think that's also an important kind of an important metric for thinking about how demanding communicative justice should be in different contexts. So yeah, I just take that, and I think it's a good point.
Can I add one little thing to that? Actually, it dovetails with something you mentioned yesterday. So when platforms get to the biggest scales, one of the new sets of problems that come to the fore is that algorithm changes that they make can put companies that depend on these platforms out of business, right? So Google Search, because it's close to a monopoly, can make a company that depends on search-based ad revenue completely unviable. And Facebook's hold on attention and news distribution has meant that every news organization now, as I understand it, basically has people trying to reverse engineer the algorithm. And it's just, the way that news is structured now has become so dependent on what it is that Facebook is doing. So I think that's a new set of harms that comes to fore when there's close to a monopoly on the way that attention is channeled.
Yeah, definitely.
I have a question for Seth. When you're talking about like an egalitarian distribution of attention, even offline, like attention is definitely not egalitarian distributed. Like people who are younger, skinnier, blonder, better looking, obviously get more attention. And so do you measure like, I guess, a distribution shift from what like an offline attention distribution that is equitable looks like and how it translates to online? Or yeah, how do you start with like a baseline that is like definitely not egalitarian?
Yeah. So what I want to focus on first of all is the sort of quantum of attention that is distributed by the platform's design and algorithm, right? So a certain amount of attention is not distributed by that, and it might be distributed instead on the basis of people's own sort of talents or the interests that they have. And ultimately, like, you're only distributing sort of, if you like, the opportunity for attention, because you can't like force people to look at the things that you're putting in front of them. So it's in a narrower domain than kind of a general sort of egalitarian distribution of attention on the whole. Now, there's an interesting question about whether the things to which we respond, the reasons why we pay attention to people, are themselves just. Like, this actually relates to there's the similar topic in the distributive justice literature, where you say, well, should we make sure that people's natural talents, that people are able to get sort of a baseline of distribution in accordance with their natural talents, and that's fair, and then we distribute the cooperative surplus fairly? Or do we question whether the natural talents themselves are fairly distributed? And you could say that, like, people, if people do happen to voluntarily choose to pay attention more to people with certain characteristics, then maybe that is something that, same as people pay more attention to folks who can tweet in an intelligent and informative and clever way, like Arvind does, are going to get more attention on that basis. Then like that's just sort of responding to their natural talents. I think there's an interesting sort of baseline there. I think things are different with different interests, like communicative interest, attention, sort of less fundamentally important than like income and wealth or those sorts of things. So I think there are important differences, and I think that there's a sort of a background issue of like, what about the fact that people are more likely to pay attention to people of people who are white, for example, and there are sort of background structural injustices in the allocation of attention that I think ought to be kind of resisted and remedied, and maybe what you're describing falls a little bit into that category.
Come back to you in just a minute.
Thanks. So we can think about this like communicative ideals to run at two levels. So one is like the communicative ideal that we want to implement or operationalize at the level of algorithmic platform or social media systems, and the other one is more this state level kind of like collect communicative ideals. And do you have like a theories as to kind of connect these two sorts of communicative ideals? Is it the case that the communicative ideals from the state, the ones that they want to operationalize, always are kind of compatible with what is happening in social media, digital public sphere, or how should we think about the relation between this?
Yeah, thank you. So this actually enables me to fill in a gap that I went over because I was going over time. So I think that the way in which you get the democratic authorization that I think is important, whilst not having kind of excessive state interference into the digital public sphere, is to have something like an articulation of what the values are that we want platforms to aim at, that gives an account of how we understand communicative justice around here, that is democratically authorized, that does come from the democratic state. And then the platform accountability to that is maintained by independent oversight. So it's not a matter of kind of micromanaging and implementing those democratic values in each moment by the power of the state, because there's too much opportunity for that to lead to sort of undermining the role of the digital public sphere in holding the state to account. But it does provide a sort of a source for the values that are being applied that has kind of democratic foundation. And that's in a way kind of more or less what you get with the Digital Services Act in the EU. It does articulate certain types of goals, more in that context around content moderation rather than amplification and architecture. But I think that's the way I see this ideally working, because otherwise you get the kind of interference and micromanagement that is clearly just intended to advance the power of particular political parties, for example, like you have with the BJP interfering with the platforms in India. So yeah, that's the line that I think needs to be drawn.
So this somewhat follows in the last question, but Seth, I want to ask you about the profit motive, because I agree with you that surveillance advertising works kind of askew to the values of justice we care about. But I wonder if we would worry in the future we figure out some other approach, we're going to miss that. Because what I mean is, it's one thing to go skew to political values. The other is to open up these kind of questions as political questions, because that invites the attention of bad actors, anti-democratic actors. So what I'm imagining here is, just as we politicize these questions about what communicative justice is, that attracts the attention of someone like Steve Bannon or the Texas legislators you've been alluding to. And so maybe it's just better, maybe it's just safer to have these questions decided by the profit motive, which is like running a non-parallel to political questions, rather than open up the attraction for anti-democratic actors.
Yeah, that is a real worry. I think that and it also depends on the nature of the background culture of a society. Like, I think that you could articulate these sorts of norms in Australia, say, and there would be sufficient kind of background agreement that it wouldn't necessarily be the start of the next culture war. And I think maybe that isn't true here. So look, there is that's a motivation for it, and it's worth sort of playing through the reason. Like, the idea is that it's a sort of content-independent approach to allocating attention, insofar as it is only based on, or it would be content-independent as far as it's only based on this motive. It isn't really content-independent because you're still looking into what's in the communication in order to figure out whether it's likely to be clicked on. But the notion is that it's a sort of neutral motivation of making profit. So it's a kind of, it would satisfy a kind of justificatory neutrality. I think that there is a big question here of incentive design. And I definitely think that it would be a big mistake to go around taking the ideas of any philosopher and putting them directly into practice anywhere. And that was something I started both lectures with. I think that we want to have these sense of what these ideals are, but in terms of designing the institutions that realize them, then you need to involve a lot more expertise in just knowing what the ideals are. I think there is, though, a sort of basic question here, like underneath all of it, and it's that, like, is there enough value in our collective attention to sustain the means of communication that would enable a healthy digital public sphere without it being kind of directly provided for by the state? And like, it seems to me that there is, maybe you couldn't have the sort of crazy runaway profits that the tech companies have had over the last 10 years, but you could certainly, I think, have a sustainable industry. So I think that you could maybe even have something like, yes, make it a profit motive, but make it like, even cap profits. I was talking about this with Solon yesterday. Like, the value that comes out of the digital public sphere, the value of our collective attention, is something that is extracted from us collectively. It is like a sort of natural resource that is pulled out of us as a mass. And there's reasons to think that it shouldn't be possible to take that and just make kind of runaway profits that then also involve imposing these externalizing these costs for everyone else. So when I said very obliquely, how do you make those who bear profits bear the cost? This could be consistent with that sort of underlying idea of justificatory neutrality. And the question would just be like, could you have a sustainable business model that didn't involve surveillance advertising and didn't involve short-term engagement optimization? And I think that you probably could. Like, you'd forego a lot of profit relative to now, but it could still be. It seems to me that it should still be possible. So that may also be another sort of a note of hope along the lines of Arvind's one before.
We're going to wrap up this evening before the discussion seminar tomorrow at 10 with 2 questions that we'll take together, and then we can finish with your remarks.
Thank you. This is for Seth. I was curious with the communicative justice, paradigm. How do you balance, democratic, egalitarian, like equality with efficacy or meritocracy? Because I think one of the implied goals of the public square is to get better outcomes, and so it seems like you have, how do you balance, good ideas, from equal, across the board?
Yeah, I think that this.
Hold on 1 second. I'm just getting careful.
Yeah. Everyone always does that when you get told to take questions.
I want a word in skepticism of the possibility of benevolent recommender systems. It seems like one of the particularly pernicious problems with recommender systems is that we seem to be ceding autonomy over our own action in one way or another. When we're trying to engage with some content, we no longer decide to pick up a book off the shelf for ourselves, or we don't surf through a series of relatively flatly distributed channels to pick a program for ourselves. Rather, we're confronted with some content. We're barraged with all this stuff that's been selected for us. And so we're kind of degrading our capacity to autonomously attend to things for ourselves. And it doesn't seem to go away when the recommender system is kinder.
That's cool. Okay. So I definitely want to hear what Arvind has to say about that second one as well. First point, look, we're trying to promote and advance people's communicative interests. And it's in our interest to hear, communicative interest, to hear things that are true and valuable and like accurate. So I think that the goal of promoting communicative interest should encapsulate that kind of the things that you're talking about there, allowing good ideas to flow to the top. The norms that constrain the promotion then kind of make limitations on how you do that, but still the ultimate goal should be to promote communicative interest. So I think that should be catered for. The question you raised there, I think, is lovely, and it draws attention to something that I wanted to say, which is that, like, I'm trying to look here at the political philosophy of attention. There's a further question about the ethics of attention, which is how you think about, like, how you allocate your own attention, you know, even individually or even as groups. And I think the question that you're raising there is a really important one, and it's one needs to think about for oneself. And yeah, I think that it does. It's a consideration that must be taken into account in the design of these systems, in as much as they should create space for sort of resistance and checking out and stepping out of the kind of the recommendation cycle. Like, it should be something that is built into their design. I still think that the basic thing of taking, like, the functionally infinite amount of content that you could be exposed to and breaking that down into something that is actually manageable and navigable for you, that for me is still kind of really important, and a really important role that these things need to play. But I'd love to hear Arvind respond to that part as well.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that's a great question. It's also a very revealing question because, well, let me tell you an experience I had 2 or 3 years ago when we were at this workshop relating to machine learning and harms, etc. I think Marion was also there. One of the participants in the workshop asked the room, has anyone thought about how to build a recommender system that doesn't try to exploit my attention, but is like a friend invested in my growth, and gives me things that I would want if I were to spend that time and make those choices. And everyone looked around the room, and no one had ever heard of research along those lines. And I think the tragedy here is that the dominance of these tech platforms has just closed off even our imagination to how recommender systems could otherwise be built. And it's absolutely true that the recommender systems today take away our autonomy, but I don't think that's an inherent property of them. And more recently, because of all this energy around how to do better, I have been seeing research proposals for a way to build recommender systems in a different way. And it's been really invigorating to see that. And I think we're going to have at least proof of concepts of those types of things in a short time frame. And then the question is, will it be possible to build them at scale and get them into the hands of people?
As we wrap up here, I can't help but thinking, as we're standing in university, about benevolent recommendation systems and the comments you've just heard, that the idea of taking a notion of content, trying to craft something that's relevant, that's in the direction of growth, that's what a syllabus is. That's what teachers at universities do all the time. With that as the last idea from the professor, please join me in thanking these two professors. Once again, 10 a.m. here tomorrow for a big, wide-ranging discussion with our two final discussants, as well as with Seth, Marion, and Arvind. Thank you.
Two down.
Sorry.
Two down.